You're listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast with Matt Tomasi and can be found at borntokickarse.com/episode 43.
Welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast, where you're introduced to the most fascinating people on the planet. Learn the ingredients of greatness that you can apply to your life. And now your host, Matthew Tomasi.
Olly Hicks is a world record-breaking adventurer, endurance athlete and motivational speaker who has produced 2 award-winning documentaries about his record-breaking ocean voyages. In 2005, Olly became the first and youngest person to row the Atlantic Ocean from America to the UK. Olly talks about his most recent expedition, kayaking from Greenland to Scotland, as well as his quest to become the first person in the world to row solo around Antarctica. Enjoy the interview. Olly Hicks, welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast.
Cheers, Matt. Thank you.
Congratulations on your most recent expedition. You did a kayaking journey from Greenland to Scotland. Well, when did you get back from that?
We got back on the 4th of September. We were very glad to get back. We started on the 1st of July this year, and we got back on the 4th of September. So it was about a 9-week trip. Now,
you're no stranger to massive expeditions and rowing expeditions. You've got quite an incredible resume. Before we sort of touch on some of the stuff that you've done, can you maybe give us a background on yourself and how you actually got into, rowing and sort of adventures on the open ocean?
Yeah, sure. And as a kid, I grew up on the east coast of England. And so in our holidays, we were always messing around on boats, like rowing boats, kayaks, that sort of thing, just on inland waterways, so on the rivers. And there was a lake near us where we could go and play as kids. I was given a kayak for my 7th birthday, and I guess it all went from those like childhood days, messing around on the water. And now I just try and make a living from messing around on the water. And from, I suppose it first became an obsession when I wanted to row the Atlantic from the age of 13. When I read about Peter Bird, who was an ocean rower, and he died rowing across the Pacific, and that was in the newspaper, and that was the first time I'd ever come across the concept of ocean rowing. And so from then on, I was reading everything I could find on the subject, and then just went from there, really. I found out about the first people who crossed the Atlantic in 1896, and I was just reading everything on the subject and set my sights on doing that row, really from the age of 13.
Was that like a solo expedition, or was it sort of part of like the Talisker Whiskey Challenge at all, or?
What, my one or Peter Bird?
The one that you did.
No, so the Talisker is relatively new. Well, it's been in existence since 1997, I guess, that Atlantic rowing race. And it used to be every 3 years. It's now every 2 years, and it's about to go every year. It's about to become an annual event. And that goes from west to east. Sorry, from east to west. From the Canaries to the Caribbean, following the trade winds. And my route was from New York back to England, so it was an independent row, not in a race, independently organised by me. And I wanted to do something that hadn't been done before. I wanted to do like an original expedition. So the race didn't really appeal to me from that point of view.
Yeah, that's incredible. So going from America to the UK, are you sort of going against the currents? Is that
You're not really going against the currents, because you do have assistance from the Gulf Stream if you get into it, but Also, the North Atlantic Drift is a current up there. And the main difference is you don't have a trade wind route, so you don't have winds like blowing consistently from west to east to push you across, which is what you have in the race. So that is really the big difference. And it took me 4 months to get across, so it was a very slow crossing. But it was the same year as Hurricane Katrina, and that was one of 5 named hurricanes that summer. So I never took a direct hit from a hurricane, but those hurricanes really conspired to mess up the weather patterns, so we didn't get any sort of consistently prevailing winds. And I was going backwards for about 34 days in total, just with headwinds. So, that's the sort of major difference that you wouldn't get in the race route.
With your preparation for the Atlantic row, were you doing any specific training in preparation for that, or had you already had many years of sort of rowing experience up to that point that you could sort of draw upon?
No, I hadn't really done, as I said, I just messed around on boats as a kid, so I could row like, a dinghy and stuff, but I'd never done any professional or like serious flat water race rowing. But there's not much to it. It's pretty basic, right? You got a couple of wooden sticks and you keep pulling them till you get to the other side. So it was I didn't have any serious athletic background. Just this obsession to do the row, and I had done a yachtmaster training course. So I was like a sort of qualified sailor, but I hadn't done any technical rowing stuff by way of background. And training wise, I just had a good general level of fitness, but nothing major. Much less training than you would think.
And how many hours per day were you averaging on that row?
So the gold standard that I always aimed for was 12 hours a day, and the average was more like 9 to 10 hours a day over the 4 months, because obviously you're interrupted by weather and that sort of thing. But basically, when you've got good weather, you want to row as much as you can. But unlike a race sort of routine where people are often, the pairs would be doing 2 hours on, 2 hours off around the clock. Some solos do that routine as well, but I don't think it's a very good one. So I just row all day and then sleep at night, straight through, like 7 hours straight through.
If we sort of fast forward to today, or, sort of now, with the planning for your most recent expedition that you've done, the Greenland to Scotland one, when did that idea first sort of pop into your mind? How did you sort of think, oh yeah, I'm going to do this particular route? When did that sort of come about?
It really sort of developed. I think I've spent too long looking at maps, and if you look at maps for too long and you like messing around in boats, then you're sort of joining the dots between land masses. And so if you look at a map, it doesn't look that far from Greenland to Iceland, Iceland to Faroes, and Faroes to Scotland. And we'd already paddled or kayaked from Shetland to Norway, and so that gap is about similar to all the gaps further north between Iceland and Greenland and Faroes. So it made sense in a way that we could do a longer trip, just linking up all those islands. And it was actually a guy called Patrick Winterton, who was an old teammate of mine, who was an ex-Marine, ex-Royal Marine and Olympics cross-country skier. And we'd done the crossing from Shetland to Norway, which was really his expedition, was his plan. And he invited me to join him. And we made that crossing third time lucky we got across. And after that, Patrick had read a book called Searching for the Finmen, which was all about the theory that the Inuit may have got from Greenland to Scotland in the sort of 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and how they could have got there. So, it explores the theory of them paddling all the way in their kayaks, or coming in, being kidnapped by sealers or whalers or fishermen, all that sort of thing. But the thing it's looking at is the fact that an Inuit did wash up in Aberdeen in northern Scotland in 1728. And how did he get there was the sort of mystery. And Patrick, he thought this was a fantastic story that we could do a sort of recreation of. by kayak, a little bit like a Kon-Tiki expedition.
With the actual planning side of things, how long did the planning phase take? Planning the logistics of what you're going to take on the kayak, the gear, medical equipment, that sort of stuff. How long did the actual planning side of stuff take?
Well, I guess it was a iterative process in a way, because we'd done a lot of build-up kayak trips. So we'd done what have we done? We'd done 3 attempts to get from Shetlands across to Norway. That was over 2 years. And then we'd done a crossing from Holland or the Netherlands across to Suffolk in the east coast of England. So that was 3. So basically it was about 5 years really in the planning and in the mix of background expeditions and build-up trips, getting us to a level of sort of technical knowledge and I suppose you could call it expertise, knowing what worked and what didn't work. And we'd learned a lot. A lot of stuff had gone wrong on earlier crossings. We tried in single kayaks and our rafting system didn't work. Our sleeping systems didn't work. So we learned the hard way over those previous trips. What didn't work. So after really the 5-year build-up, we had good systems for sleeping. We had good systems for navigating. We had good systems for keeping warm. So the planning was more straightforward. Perhaps the most difficult thing was building a new kayak or adapting the kayak for this trip, because it had to be able to cope with the ice. It had to be big enough for us to sleep in. And George is a tall guy. He's 6'7". So we had to stretch the boat a bit for him to sleep in. And then we had to raise quite a lot of money for this one, because we had to get up to Greenland, which is an expensive place to get to. And then Red Bull got involved quite late on, so there was various requirements for them to be able to do the filming or filming parts of the expedition. So I'd say, long answer short, was about a 5-year process to be able to get to pulling off the Greenland to Scotland expedition in a safe and professional manner.
George Bullard, who I interviewed way back on episode 10. How did you meet George, and how did George sort of get involved with this particular expedition?
So I came across George because weirdly I know his cousin, and when I was working in the city for a bit headhunting, and he could come to us for an interview. So that was really the first time I'd come across him. And of course I knew about his, what it's like. It's a small world in the adventure community. So I knew about Alex Hibbert and his trip across Greenland, the double ski across Greenland they made in, I don't know, what was it, in 2003, 2005. So I was aware of that trip, and I thought that was a really good benchmark. Like if you had the rocks in your head enough to be able to ski from one side of Greenland and then turn around and follow your tracks back in a zero stimulus environment, I thought that was perfect sort of the mental fortitude that was required for this paddling expedition. So I came across George that way, and then, as I said, it was Patrick's idea to do this journey, and he was meant to be coming with me initially, and then after I'd started putting the wheels into motion, and so it was Patrick's idea. I started initiating it, raising the money, building the new boat, and then Patrick had his first kid during that time, and so his priorities then changed, and he thought the risk was too high, and he also had a job working on the Rio Olympics, so he had to withdraw from the expedition, and suddenly I needed to find a new teammate. And I think George had just dropped me an email, and I thought, this. And so we had lunch, and we were talking about it, and he was super keen for it. He was like mega up for it. And I think a big requirement for these trips is someone with the risk appetite, perhaps, and someone who doesn't have too many responsibilities, i.e. family and kids. It's a sobering but real possibility. So, or consideration. And George is a young guy, he's 27, so he didn't have those constraints. And he was so enthusiastic and keen that, and had the background from his polar stuff, and he didn't have a kayaking background, but he could learn that really quickly. Because that's what I'd done, and I'm a great believer that you don't need to be an expert in these things to pick it up. And so George went and did a crash course in kayaking, and within a week he was really competent. He learned stuff really fast. So,
would you have to do a lot of sort of upper body strength work in addition to maybe your normal sort of kayaking training? Do you have to sort of do a lot of lat work or upper body strength work in preparation for something like this?
I think that the thing with kayaking is such a specific sort of action and motion, maybe less unlike rowing, which you're using the really major muscle groups, like your legs and your back. Whereas with the kayaking, you're relying a lot on your shoulders, on the sort of rotator cuff joint, and on your wrists. There's a lot of strain going through some much smaller muscle groups and tendons. So you really need to be trying to protect those. And therefore, we're doing a lot of, I was doing a lot of physio. I was recovering from an injury. Actually came off a motorbike in the outback about a year before, and I had to have surgery. So I had to build up my left shoulder again to protect that. And so I was doing quite a lot of, lat work, cable pulls, and a lot of core stability, of course. And I was doing a lot of CrossFit. Actually, I find CrossFit is a really good all-round strengthening, sort of core strengthening training technique. And then we're doing quite a lot of time in the boat, although not as much time as you'd think. Our main effort was on technique in the boat. So both forward paddling technique and emergency recovery. If the boat got swamped or if we got capsized and we're swimming, how do you get back into the boat quickly? And then for distance and stamina training, there's a couple of islands off Land's End, which is the southern tip of England. And so we'd kayak out to the Scilly Isles, which is about 25 miles out. And we did that about 5 times. We'd kayak out, camp on the islands, then kayak back. And then psychologically also that was good because it gets you out of sight of land. And it's quite eye-opening being so far out of sight of land in such a small boat. So I wanted George to get used to that side of life as well.
With the actual kayak, you mentioned before that it was modified. What sort of modifications were made to the kayak specifically for this trip?
So by and large, it was a production kayak, i.e. you could buy it from Inuk Kayaks, who are the manufacturer. It was built by a guy called Rob Falloy, who owns Inuk, and he built Lot 41 or Lot 42, which is the James and Justin from Crossing the Ditch. He built their kayak. So he's got a background in expedition kayaks as well as sort of ocean crossing ones. And I've done a couple of other projects with him in the past. So he's a great guy. And the cheapest or the solution we came to was that we would take one of his production boats, a 2-man production boat, but because it needed to be longer, and I wanted a bit more freeboard in it, because it comes out of a mold, so you mold the bottom bit of the boat and then you mold the top bit separately. So we did the 2 molds and then we cut them, added 3 feet of carbon fiber into the middle section, 3 foot lengthwise, and we added in about I think 1.5 inches of freeboard into it just to get us a little bit higher above the water and keep us a bit drier. And then we glued it all back together. So yeah, was a bit of a modification there. And you also move the internal bulkheads so that they're far enough apart so you have space to sleep inside it. So that's the main structural modifications. And then the only other real modification is that we insulate it with foam. We insulate the actual cockpits where we're sitting so that then when you're sleeping in there, you are insulated from the cold of the water. We also have very high-capacity electric bilge pumps which operate off sealed lithium batteries, waterproof sealed lithium batteries. So if the boat does get swamped, we can hit the switches and should be able to pump out the boat in about 80 seconds. And then the other big modification, of course, is the sleeping system. And that is a tent over each cockpit, which sort of folds up and down a bit like a convertible car hood. And it zips together over your head once you've wriggled down inside. And when we have airbags, two big 40-litre airbags either side of each man. So that's giving you the stability to sleep. And we also put out a little drogue or a small sea anchor on a 30-metre line. So once you've got all that deployed, you're pretty stable and you can sleep.
When you guys slept, did you both sort of agree to sleep at a certain time, or did you sort of take turns, like one guy would sleep, another guy would still paddle? How did you approach the sleep side of things?
So obviously the ideal would have been that one could sleep and one could paddle, but in fact the boat was too heavy for one man to make any meaningful progress. So we took turns. So we'd sleep at the same time, and the work system was, or the ideal work system was, and obviously it would be interrupted by the weather, but ideally we were looking at 5 minutes rest every hour, and then every 5 hours you'd have a 20-minute break, and then every 17 hours you would have a sleep. And that sleep the length of that sleep would depend on whatever we agreed, really, how tired we were. Sometimes we wouldn't make a plan, we'd just sleep, and then the first one to wake up would wake up the other one. And it might depend on the weather or whatever, but that's what we found worked best. And actually for our longest crossing from Iceland to Faroe Islands, which is a bit of what are called the Devil's Dance Floor, we're into that routine and we stuck to it for the whole thing, and it worked really well. And it made the crossing, almost hesitate to use the word easy, but that was great because you can always get through the next hour, and then we're getting enough sleep to be sort of functional and switched on. So it was really a good work system, I would say.
When you departed, this part of the world is freezing. I've never been up that far north in the world. I've been to Norway, but not sort of where you guys were. What sort of dangers and, when you're sort of going to embark on a trip like this, what are the main things that you need to prepare for? Like I'm thinking hypothermia. What other stuff were you planning for and, had to really be sort of mindful of? You mentioned ice as well. How sort of icy is it, when you're kayaking from Greenland to Iceland? Is there massive sort of icebergs, or what's it like out there?
Yeah, so I guess the main dangers were, as you say, cold, hypothermia, wildlife in terms of polar bears and drowning, really, or sort of, I guess, coming back to cold. But if we capsize and we're in the water for too long, being able to get back in the boat and get going again before you you lose dexterity, and then it's like a downward spiral. Once you can't use your hands anymore, then you're pretty screwed. So cold, wildlife, and I guess dynamic injuries from stuff like crashing into ice or getting washed up against icebergs or having to do surf landings. Those were probably our biggest concerns. And actually cooking was quite dangerous. Obviously, George was the cook, and he had to cook with an open flame between his legs in a tiny rocking boat. So he got boiling water, naked flame, tiny space, not ideal. So just to take those in order, I guess I thought cold would be the biggest issue, especially when we started up in Greenland. We're in amongst icebergs and pack ice, actually not that thick, but significant nonetheless. But we got dropped off by a yacht in the pack ice, and it was too thick for the yacht to go all the way to the Greenland coast. So it dropped us in the ice, and took us about 3 or 4 hours to get clear of the ice. But because it was pretty calm, there was not really a risk of getting crushed or trapped there. And we were then under the midnight sun, so it was light all the time. So psychologically, that was a big difference. We didn't get so tired, and we made a really long first session. I think we did 20 hours in the first paddling stint, and then we slept, and it actually wasn't that cold. Like, the water temperature was probably about 2 degrees or 1 degree, but the air temperature would, I'd say, more like 7 or 8 degrees, which is quite cold. But once you're on your dry suit, you've got a layer of thermals underneath and you're working. That's not too bad. And so to avoid the cold when we're sleeping, obviously you're trying not to sweat too much inside your dry suit, which we'd achieve by venting the suit. So either cracking the zips open, or we had a method of holding open the seals, the neck seals, so that you would get some airflow through the suit.
So with the dry suit, is it literally are you completely covered? Is it just sort of your head head and hands exposed?
Yeah, it's like being inside a human condom. You're literally like, you're everything. The only bits which are unsealed are your hands and your neck. So you've got latex seals at your wrists and a latex seal at your neck. But other than that, you're completely sealed up inside. It's like being in a bag.
And what do you have thermals on underneath that as well?
Then you just got one layer of fleece thermals underneath was what we wore. And that's a good system. Generally didn't get too cold. And then you got zips, so you can go to the loo. And venting the neck would get enough, because they're Gore-Tex as a suit, so they are breathable. But the Gore-Tex can be a little bit less effective in the freezing cold. And as they get dirtier and more used, and they can be a bit less effective on the breathability. So we actually had 2 sets of dry suits. We had one for our ocean crossings, which we tried to keep absolutely pristine. And then we had a set of slightly heavier duty, like military spec dry suits for going around the coasts, where we like going through the surf or coming up on rocky beaches. Excuse me. And so that worked really well in terms of keeping the gear in good nick. And then before we would sleep, we'd always do some cooking. So we'd get some hot food inside us, hot food, maybe coffee, before we went to sleep. So we'd raise our core body temperature a bit. And also we had chemical heaters, little chemical heat packs, which we drop inside our dry suits.
Yeah, they're good. I've used them before.
Yeah, from a company called Blizzard Systems, and they're fantastic. Like the medics use them a lot for cold casualties. They're excellent.
With the you mentioned that time of year, is it pretty much light for 24 hours? Does it get dark at all?
Yeah, when we started in Greenland, I mean, the sun sets for about 20 minutes. Okay. So, it doesn't, so it sets, but it doesn't really go down below the horizon much. So it's light. Yeah, it's very light for 24 hours.
Does that sort of stuff up your body clock in terms of your recovery? So, for example, you've paddled all, for many hours during the day, and you're sort of winding down, I guess, for the day, and the sun's still out. Obviously you probably don't really feel that urge to sleep and in turn recover. Did that sort of affect any sort of recovery or sleep that you guys tried to get?
No, I wouldn't say so. Just psychologically, we loved the midnight sun. If it was light all the time, it makes life easier. And by and large, you're sleeping inside a kayak, so it's pretty grim. So by the time you're tired enough to sleep in the kayak, the light is almost incidental. So no, it didn't affect us in any way. It's actually, we much preferred having the midnight sun than when it started to get dark, as the days got shorter later in the expedition.
Like, if one of you guys had fallen out into the ocean, how long would you have before you start to potentially die? Is it minutes?
Well, I always think you have to take it with a pinch of salt, this information, because it changes. It's such a personal thing. So if you're best case scenario, you fall in, you're in a sealed dry suit, all your zips are done up. You've got one layer of thermals underneath. So I would say the problem is not that you're going to die, because is that you lose dexterity. That's the initial big problem, because then once you've lost your dexterity, you can't help yourself. So that's when you get into a situation where, say the life rafts are in the rear hatch. If your hands don't work to be able to take the seal off the hatch to get at the life raft, then you get in a sort of trouble. But I think if you were floating around in your dry suit, you'd probably last for 3 hours, 4 hours. I don't know, something like that. But we did have little single seat life rafts, so you could get in that, so you'd be out of the water. And then I suspect you would be okay for, 24 hours. You'd be cold, but you'd be okay. And hopefully you'd get out with some of your more insulating clothing as well, which you could put over the top.
And also with the animals that you mentioned before, walruses, are they being an actual issue potentially during the kayak across, from Greenland to Iceland, for example, or are they sort of more of a danger as you get close to the coastline?
So we were worried about walrus and polar bears because they're incredibly territorial walrus, and if they start attacking you, they'll attack you till the boat's destroyed, or you're destroyed. So we had a rifle which we could dispatch any walrus with. They probably would be more of a risk closer in, but they do also go quite far offshore. We didn't actually see any in the end, nor did we see any polar bears, which was the other risk. And any expedition in Greenland has to carry a rifle for mainly the polar bear threat. And we didn't see any, but 1 week after we'd landed in Iceland, another polar bear landed in the same place, and it landed pretty much where we had, and it had swum all the way across the Denmark Strait. So, depending where he'd come from, he must have swum 200 to 400 kilometers. And that often happens when the bears will get stuck on an ice floe, and they'll drift close to Iceland. But there wasn't enough ice for that to be the case, so he must have swum, easily 200 kilometers. Incredible.
With the food, how did you eat? Did you have did you go fishing at all, or what sort of food did you pack in the kayak?
So we had packed rations of freeze-dried food, all dehydrated food, and that was pretty good. And then we had a jet boil to cook it on. So George would boil the water in a jet boil between his legs, and we could only do that when it was pretty calm, because as I said, he's got his dry suit on, so he's got the jet boil between his legs. So a naked flame plus a pot with, say, a litre of boiling water in, and then he's got to try and pour the boiling water into the food bags. So a bit of a juggling act, but it was a hassle to do. Like anything beyond paddling is a real hassle in the kayak, because you're so cramped. Your organisation is key. Your kit organisation and admin is critical, because you've got to do everything from your sitting position. You can't really reach your toes, so trying to get anything out of the boat is difficult. You have to be very aware of where you're packing your kit.
With the positioning of your legs, do you sort of just alternate between sort of cross-legged versus legs out straight? Is there enough room for you to make sort of those adjustments?
No, you couldn't cross your legs. You'd have to have them out straight. And you just have 2 foot pedals either side of the cockpit. So that's what you brace on when you're paddling. And George's cockpit was a bit bigger, but still he wouldn't have been able to cross his legs. So it was really just, it's a bit like a coffin. There's room to lie in it with your arms crossed, but you couldn't really have your arms by your sides, if that makes sense. So it gives a idea of how cramped it is.
Did you ever get any cramps at all?
No, I didn't. I was all right, but I think George had a bit of trouble with his lower back because he's a tall guy, and you could stretch it out to a degree by lying down. You could lie out flat. That was the saving grace. But
Now, the actual journey from Greenland to Iceland, how, in terms of the seas and the waves and that, is that particular leg more dangerous than the Iceland to Scotland leg in terms of the weather and the waves, or are they sort of pretty much similar?
Yeah, so that was my assumption from the outset, was that the Greenland Iceland leg would be the worst or the most dangerous because of the cold. But yeah, I think people, statistically, you could look at an area and you say, right, the average wind speed and wave height in this area is higher than this area. But the trouble with that is then you're working on statistics and averages. Do you know what I mean? And at any time, you could get massive waves and massive winds in one area. So the statistics are irrelevant to a degree. And, we're working on an expedition down in the Southern Ocean, and people are always like, you can't do anything in the Southern Ocean, it's suicidal, you'll die. But I would argue that you could get the conditions you're getting in the Southern Ocean anywhere in the North Atlantic. It is still a very hostile sea. I mean, when we were in the Faroes, there was a storm one night out at sea, and it was ripping containers off the container ships. So you think of the height of a container ship deck above the surface of the sea, and then it's ripping them off. So you've got green water running up that's got to be an 80-foot wave, right? So I think, you can look at the statistics to get an idea, but at the same time, you've got to be aware that you can get really bad weather and really bad sea conditions anywhere. But the risk, and what we were concerned of, was the combined effect of very bad weather with really freezing conditions would perhaps jeopardize our ability to survive those conditions for as long as we could on a slightly warmer latitude. But luckily, we'd been watching the weather really closely in Iceland, and we saw a nice weather window, a nice gap, where we were going to get like maximum force 5 or 6 winds. And that became our threshold, if you like, that we didn't really want to paddle in any more than force 5 or 6, certainly not for the ocean crossings.
Did the kayak ever capsize at all or turn over? G'day guys, Matt here. This podcast is a labour of love, and all episodes are researched, scheduled, edited, created and promoted in my spare time. Typically, after an episode has been recorded, it can take another 3 hours of post-production activities to get the final cut. If I'm providing you with value and you wish to support my vision of sharing these inspirational stories to the world, you can do so at borntokickarse.com and click on the Patreon banner. Your support will help to maintain the monthly podcast running costs and enable me to outsource repetitive tasks so I can bring you even more Kick Arse episodes. Once again, if you want to support me in producing this podcast, head over to borntokickarse.com and click on the Patreon banner. You can't miss it. And now back to the rest of the show. Did the kayak ever capsize at all or turn over?
No, we never capsized in anger. Nearly, we came close a few times, but our training had been a lot about avoiding capsize, and you can learn all these support strokes and bracing techniques, so that you can get knocked right over on your side, but you can still avoid it going all the way over. So we got knocked over a couple of times, but we were able to keep it up the right way.
Yeah. Is there a keel at all?
No, not at all. Just a flat bottom boat.
Yeah, so was there a particular point on that expedition that you sort of, really struggled with?
Yeah, the hardest bits were when the weather was bad and we were stuck on shore. Because like I said, we had a sort of threshold of weather we didn't want to go into, because it would just be a bit fruitless and a bit too risky to paddle in it. And that was the frustrating time, because then you're stuck ashore, you don't know when the weather's going to change. and you're there ready to paddle. So when you can't paddle, it's quite frustrating. And you got limited sort of equipment, or so you're just a bit stuck. You're just like camping out. It's like waiting to climb a mountain and you're camped out in your tent. So it's a bit boring, and you just want to keep going. So those were I would say, the hardest bits from that frustration point of view. Like in the Faroe Islands, we got stuck there for 3 weeks waiting for a window to get down to Scotland. So that was really tough.
Whereabouts did you stay on the islands?
So in the Faroes, we actually stayed with a fisherman, a very nice guy who put us up in the capital of Faroes. So we stayed with him for a bit, and then we also stayed in an outward bound sort of outdoor school in the south of the Faroes, which I cannot pronounce the name of, but they let us keep our kayak there, and so we stayed with them for a bit. But just because it was getting later in the season, the longer we waited, and therefore the chances of getting a nice weather window were becoming less and less likely. But thank goodness we did. And in terms of actually being at sea and being in a bad spot, we were all right. I mean, we had a couple of gales. We got hammered a couple of times going around Iceland, where we got caught out in gales, and we got a bit complacent because we'd had a good crossing from Greenland to Iceland. We hadn't been watching the weather as carefully as we should have been, so we got stuck in a few gales, and that was quite scary, and it just makes it really hard. I mean, we were probably at one point we're doing a big fjord crossing that was about 30 miles wide, and we're making about 1 mile an hour trying to go into a very strong headwind, but breaking seas. So you're just getting hammered, just like breaking waves coming over you, going really slowly, like the horizon doesn't seem to get any closer. And you're in a way just waiting for the wind to subside, or you're hoping the wind's going to subside. And so you get let up so you can then get back ashore. Anyway, we're a little bit more careful watching the weather after that.
I've seen some other photos. You had some sails as well. What's that
That's
like
right.
when the sails are put up and there's a good sort of wind behind you? What's that like?
Yeah, so the sails came from a company called Flat Earth Kayak Sales. It's an Australian business, and they were fantastic. I've used them before, and there was concerns if they were too flimsy for like a long duration expedition, and actually they were fantastic. We didn't have any problems with them all the way through. And so when I'd say we used them about 60% of the time, like whenever we had a wind, a tailwind of any sort, we would use them. And it didn't really increase like our top speed. Well, sometimes when it was really windy, it would help. But normally we could paddle about as fast as we could sail. But the big difference with the sails is that it increased probably our average speed. And it also unloads the boat. So when the boat's at its heaviest, it's probably 300 kilos. And so using the sails would just lighten the load a bit. So you're reducing the strain on your shoulders and wrists. And that was a real game changer for us. And it's a lot more fun having the sails up as well.
When you're approaching land, like an island of some sort, how dangerous is that, as you're approaching land? Is there a real risk of getting blown onto rocks and stuff like that?
Yeah, there is. For sure. You're a bit like a hot air balloon, right? Because you're essentially an unpowered vehicle. Or maybe we have a bit more control than the hot air balloon, but yeah, if the wind is really strong and the seas are huge and they're pushing you to the rocks, and there's not so much you can do about it. And yeah, you can paddle out. Hopefully you can paddle out. And we came, I'd say, only close once to getting washed up on the rocks. And we were fortunate to find a bay that we could run into, really run out of the storm from. So you are at the mercy of the elements to a large degree.
What was it like when you saw Scotland? You could see sort of the Scotland, in the horizon. You can see the land, and as you started to approach that, what was that feeling like as you're sort of coming to the end of this adventure?
Yeah, that was fantastic when we could see Scotland, because we'd already been So we were stuck in the Faroes for 3 weeks, and then we got off the Faroes, and then the weather closed in before we actually got to Scotland, so we had to take refuge on an island which was about 50 miles north of Scotland, a little island called North Rona. And we ended up stuck on that island for a week. And we're surrounded by a storm for a week, so there were just huge Atlantic swells crashing onto the island. So we're watching the storm from this uninhabited island for a week, so only me and George on the island. And we just stuck there. It was a little refuge hut, so we've been hunkered down there. And so then we got a text message on the satellite phone saying there's a little weather window coming. It's about 20 hours. So we knew we had 20 hours to get across to Scotland before the weather went bad again. And so we raced, and we did it in a non-stop, that 50 miles. And by now, it's really dark at night. There's no more midnight sun because we're into September. And so we just paddled through the night. We're having to dodge through the fishing boats. And, as the sun came up, we could just see the mountains in the northwest of Scotland. And, incredible sight and huge relief in a way, but of course, you're still 20 miles offshore or whatever. And so even though you're almost there, you can't really relax. Like, you think you're going to make it, but I would say that's the thing, whether you're 20 miles offshore or 200 miles offshore, you're still in literally in deep water in a tiny boat. And so until you're on the shore, I never felt able to relax or think that you've made it, because, and a lot of people will know the story of Andrew Macaulay, and he was 30 miles off Milford Sound, 80 k's off Milford Sound. Anyway, he could see the land, but you still can't relax even when you can see the land. So yeah, it was a huge feeling of excitement, but not a feeling of relief. No feeling of relief until we're into the final bay, and we're like a kilometre from the beach, and it was flat water, and then I was relaxed. And I knew we were going to do it then.
So how long did it take you end to end, like to get from start to finish? How long were you kayaking for? Or how long did the whole journey take?
I think we were 63 days on the expedition. And as I said, we were stuck in Faroes for about 3 weeks of that. So we'd anticipated paddling every day for about 6 weeks, which is probably about what we did. So probably paddling for about 42 days. And then the rest of the time we were stuck, sort of storm-bound somewhere or other.
Do you sort of have that rocking feeling, when you're back on dry land and you're sort of sleeping for the first night? Do you still have that sort of rocking feeling as though you're still out on the ocean?
I wouldn't call it a rocking motion. You have you just can't walk because you've been cramped up in the boat for so long. You have to almost crawl out of the boat. And George actually didn't suffer as much as me. I think I fell over every time I get out of the boat. When we did the Shetland crossings, me and Patrick, I couldn't feel my toes on my right foot for about 6 months afterwards. I think you suffer a bit of nerve damage because your heels are wedged into the bottom of the boat, so there's quite a lot of pressure on them. So yeah, you really can't walk properly. It's a bit like you just sort of got cramp. You've just been sitting down for 5 days. So yeah, you just your legs don't work properly, but they come back pretty quickly, and you could be okay in a day or so.
Now you're actually working towards another world first. Can you tell us about your upcoming expedition that you're currently sort of working towards?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2009, I made an attempt on a round the world row, starting in Tasmania, in Cockle Creek, Tasmania, and got about 3 months off, and I landed in New Zealand because we had a problem with the boat, and the boat went sideways more than forwards, so it was like a design error really from the outset, and it wasn't safe or sensible to continue on. So we stopped in New Zealand, and really been trying to get that project off the ground on and off ever since 2010. And now I am back on that project full time, and so I'm hoping to leave from Sydney this time in 2018, around Christmas 2018. So we've got a new boat design, We've got the prototype already, and looking to leave Sydney in 2018 and row from Sydney across the Southern Ocean to South Georgia in the South Atlantic, and then stop there for the winter, take on a resupply, and continue across the Southern Ocean back around to Sydney. So it'll be about a 1.5-year trip, all through the Southern Ocean, and so hopefully be second time lucky.
And what sort of boat is that? What sort of boat are you going to
Well,
use?
it's kind of similar to the boats that the other ocean rowing boats you see. So it's that basic design. It looks a bit like a bottle. You have a sealed cabin in the front, sealed cabin at the back. You live in one end. You have storage in the other end. It's self-righting. It's made of carbon fiber. They're pretty light. Although this one will be less light because you have to carry supplies for so long. And you're self-sufficient. So you have a water maker, solar panels to generate power, a wind generator, and again, this is a bit of a trade wind route. So, like the old clipper ships from the 19th century, you trying to use the westerlies, the roaring 40s. Really, you're in the roaring 40s and the furious 50s, which are the strong winds that blow from west to east. So you're trying to hitch a ride on those winds, a bit like the trade winds that the Atlantic race relies on. So it's a very extreme environment, but with the right boat design, you should be able to take advantage and work with the elements rather than against them.
Yeah, how big are the waves in the Southern Ocean? I've heard they can be massive.
It can get huge waves because the reason the seas get so big is partly they're driven around the world by the roaring 40s and the furious 50s, and so you've got these waves and swell patterns going round and round the world, growing and growing. And unlike the other, even though they're huge oceans, the Pacific, the Atlantic, they are still contained between the continents, if you like. Whereas in the Southern Ocean, there's nothing really containing it. It just they're just rolling around the bottom of the world, and the only part that's constraining them is the Drake Passage, which is the bit of sea the bit of ocean between South America and Antarctica. And so that's only a 500-mile gap, and that's where you can get some huge seas as they get squashed between that gap. And that's why Cape Horn is obviously a very famous and frightening place in maritime folklore. And obviously a lot of ships have been lost there over the years.
I interviewed a guy called Tim Jarvis who recreated the Shackleton expedition.
Yeah, I know Tim.
He, recreated Shackleton's journey by landing on South Georgia. If you're sort of aiming for South Georgia, and I guess for people who don't really know where South Georgia is, it's right at the bottom, a little bit to the east of the bottom of South America. If you miss South Georgia, there's no other land between South Georgia and it's
South Africa.
Yeah, South Africa. It's like thousands and thousands of kilometres. What are you going to do if you miss South Georgia?
Don't miss it. Yeah, don't miss it. You're in big trouble. You don't want to miss it. So you probably would take emergency supplies for that time, and also we'll have to have a part of the stipulation of being on South Georgia is we probably have to have a support boat to overwinter there. So as we go into South Georgia, it'll probably be a rendezvous with a support boat, which will be carrying the supplies for the resupply to be able to carry on the second leg. And so you would probably do a rendezvous with that boat, and if you'd got drifted past South Georgia, maybe you'd have to do some sort of recovery with that support boat.
So what is it about the ocean and rowing or kayaking that you love?
I think it's I love planning the expeditions. I love the planning and the build-up to the expeditions, that project management of taking something that perhaps no one's ever done before. And a lot of people think is it's improbable, or some people say it's impossible, and then you bring it to fruition, So it's completely your baby, and and you make it happen against the odds. I think that's a big part of the excitement, and coming up with original expedition ideas, and bringing them to fruition is a big part of it. And then actually being at sea, I love being at sea. I love the oceans, and being alone in those environments is incredible. It's just so beautiful. The Southern Ocean is one of the most incredible environments I've ever been in. It's just so wild, and you can't get that sense of wilderness, I don't think, anywhere else, or isolation. Certainly not anywhere I've been to on land. I've been in deserts and in the mountains, but I've never had that sense of a wilderness or watery sort of wastes like you get in the middle of the ocean when you're totally alone. And especially in a kayak, you never feel so vulnerable or small or insignificant in your whole life than in a tiny kayak in the middle of the ocean. So it's a pretty, I would say, privileged way to see some incredible, spectacular parts of the world. By kayak, you're not really intruding into the natural world, so you'll be going past colonies of seals or seabirds, and they're not really disturbed by you because you're silent. You're small, you're almost like a sea creature. You're at the surface level, and often you're traveling slower than a lot of the wildlife, so you see so much of the natural world traveling at such a slow speed. And I guess that's a real antidote to regular life on land, where our lives are so fast paced and hectic and busy. You don't have time to sort of appreciate what's going on around you so much.
Have you ever had dolphins or whales come up and travel with you for a bit?
Almost every day you're seeing whales, dolphins, seabirds. Even the sort of plankton is fascinating. At night, you're getting bioluminescent plankton, sort of flashing and pulsing below the boat. The stars are incredible, and shooting stars, and you're almost seeing these sights, these natural sights that no one else will ever see in a way. A bit like people who have been in the North Pole, they say, that's a real privilege, is you're seeing these ice formations which are temporarily built and formed, these huge sort of cathedrals of ice, and then they're destroyed the following season or even in the following week, and no one else will ever see that. And I guess that's a bit similar at sea. It is a constantly changing environment, and it can be the calmest, most tranquil place in the world, or it can be the most violent and terrifying place.
Of all the expeditions and adventures you've been on, is there one that sort of sticks out for you as being your proudest moment?
I think that's a really interesting question, man. Quite a difficult one. I guess because I'm on a bit of a journey, so I've never really felt that huge sense of achievement after an expedition, perhaps because I've been so chasing this around the world project now, and I've tried once and it didn't work out, and so that perhaps, I think a lot of explorers have that sense that it's the next big project and the next big project, and that's what drives them in a way, and so they never feel that sense of satisfaction or fulfillment. I know some guys have come back from really big trips and it's always been an anticlimax, because what are they expecting at the end? And if the trip itself hasn't been the fulfilling part, then it can often only be a letdown. Often, like any big event in your life, afterwards it's a bit flat. And I think that's often the case. And for me, because I've got this big project in the future and coming up, maybe I think that will be the proudest moment. But tricky question. But I guess one of the projects I'm most proud of or enjoyed the most was my Atlantic row, because it was such a pure expedition in a way. I started on the dock in New York, or just south of New York, and landed on the beach in England, and there was sort of nothing in between. Or just rowing all the way across. I did have to take a resupply of food, But, that was a ship that I bumped into by chance. And so it was just a really pure trip with no, we weren't making a film. There was no one else involved. It was just sort of one man in the sea, in a way. And I really loved that trip. I really fell into loving the solitude. And I guess it was the success of that trip and the enjoyment of that trip that led me to take it on as a career and do what I'm doing now and trying to do more trips similar to that. But I think that purity of expeditioning, I don't know if you liken it to walking solo to the North Pole or climbing Everest, but without oxygen and Sherpas. It's that purity without a lot of the trappings of, without being constrained by making a film about it or, if I'd stopped short of the finish line and had to get towed in for the last 5 miles, that sort of thing. It was just very pure. Started on the dock, finished on the beach, with no interference, no external interference, I guess, in between. And I think it can be quite unusual to have those expeditions where you don't have to have some sort of third-party assistance.
Now, if you could make a phone call to the 20-year-old Olly Hicks and give him some advice, what would you tell him?
I think it would have to be that I think it would be the advice on seeking sponsorship that I've sort of learned over the years. And, it's really like setting up a business. Every expedition, you need to see it like a business, because if you want someone else to pay for your expedition, you've really got to justify what they're going to get in return for that. And, often they're giving you a lot of money and, they're not paying for your holiday. As a business transaction, they want a return on their investment. So I think that's what I'd give him, that advice of how do you provide that return? What are you going to do? So if you're going to sponsor my next expedition, what am I going to do for you? Am I going to make you a film? Am I going to be doing interviews and who for? And can we get it lined up in advance so that that you're going to get a good return? And I think coming up with and perhaps tailoring your expeditions so that they are interesting for an audience to follow. I think it's changed. I think the sponsorship model has changed quite a lot from just having stickers on the side of a boat. People, the sponsorship needs a greater return than that nowadays. And it's, the subtleties and the nuance of how you generate that return for a backer. That is quite a complex world. And I think as adventurers, we have to raise the bar in terms of what we're doing and provide that great and professional return so that it becomes really an appealing thing for sponsors to want to back expeditions rather than a bit of a sideshow. We should be raising the bar to the level where they want to sponsor expeditions and adventures as much as they want to sponsor the Six Nations rugby or, Aussie rules, whatever it is.
And whereabouts can people find you online? Reach out and say hi and, follow your expeditions. Whereabouts can people find you?
Sure. The best place is my website, which is just ollyhicks.com, OLLYHICKS.com. And then that's got links to my social media and that sort of stuff. And it's probably going to be a bit quiet for the next few months. We're just building up to raising the funds for the next round the world row. So, you can see some of the past trips and the more recent trip that George and I made from Greenland to Scotland, and some great images from that trip. And actually, Red Bull, the film that Red Bull have made about that, will come out in I think early next year. So I guess we'll be publicising that over the social media.
Yeah, that'd be good. I'll keep an eye out for that. But good luck with the training and the planning, and get everything sort of lined up, for your next expedition. And thanks again for coming onto the podcast.
No worries, Matt. Good to speak to you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thanks, mate.
You've just been listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast at borntokickarse.com. If you liked what you heard and want more, please subscribe on iTunes, give a 5-star rating and a Kick Arse review. This really helps to boost our presence and continues to allow us to introduce you to the most fascinating people on the planet. Welcome aboard, and catch you next time.